Alright, today we are starting off government class by looking at the principles of government. In this unit we're going to be covering chapters 1 and 2 together, but before we get started we really need to know what government is. So I'm going to give you a couple definitions to start things off. So government and the state. Government is an institution through which a society makes and enforces its public policies. So what are public policies? Well, public policies are things that a government does, just the things that they do in the course of their year of work. Something that's kind of interesting is that government is one of the oldest human inventions, that it is one of the first things that developed in civilization, that it's one of the first things that was needed. And so it's had thousands of years to develop. As a result, we have a very complex idea of what government is, what government should do, what government is capable of. So, like I said, we were going to talk about government and the state, so kind of need to know what a state is. A state has 4 criteria, and I know we like to think about the United States, so we think like Iowa as a state, but it actually has a different meaning from that. A state is kind of more like a nation. We have several states within our state of the United States. So let's look at those 4 criteria. The first is that it has to have a population, a body of people. The smallest population in the world is a small little island called San Marino, and the largest is India. The second criteria is that it needs to have a defined territory. There's a certain boundary to it. Again, the smallest is San Marino, and the largest is Russia. So every state has a defined border or defined territory. The third is that they are organized politically, which just means that they have some sort of government, that's some form of ruling body. And then the fourth is that they have the power to make or enforce its own laws, which means that it has sovereignty. Now, sovereignty just means that you have supreme and absolute power within your territory. Nobody can question you. So when we look at some examples of what a state is, the state of Utah here in the United States, is it a state? Well, it has a population, it has a territory, it has its own state government, but is it sovereign? Does it have anybody saying, no, you can't do that? Yes, it does. It has the United States government saying they have to follow certain rules. If you look at, let's say, the country of France, yes, it has a population. Yes, it has a territory. Yes, it has a government. And yes, it has the power to make and enforce its own law. Yes, it is sovereign. So it would be a state, whereas Utah would not be. So let's try a tricky one. Puerto Rico. Population? Yes. Territory? Yes. Government? Yes. Is it sovereign? So there's a good question. Think about that. Is it sovereign? We'll talk about that in class the next time we meet. So, political scientists have often thought about, okay, why do these different forms of government, or why do states form? Why do we get these different nations? Because everybody develops differently. Well, there's 4 basic theories. The first is called the force theory. And the force theory means that people gained control of an area through force. Pretty self-explanatory. You make others submit to you. You make them follow your rule. Great example of this could be Nazi Germany. Another good example would be the United States. We forced the people here to conform to our form of government. So that's another great example. Excuse me. The second theory is evolutionary theory. And evolution just means that you are naturally forming. And so the evolutionary theory of government is that you naturally form through the family unit. That typically the father or the male is the head of the family, and that's your government in the family unit. And eventually, as you get more and more families together, the males all join together. You get a council of elders typically that lead the clan, or they lead the tribe, or they lead the village, and then eventually they expand that, and one family becomes the ruling family. A great example of countries that follow the evolutionary theory would be the African nations, where they just built out of the family complex and then had rulers that were kings or queens. So that's a great example. Another theory is the divine right theory. And the divine right theory basically just says that some form of religion, God, goddess, whatever, gave the person the right to rule, gave the government the right to rule. And so the ruler, the king or queen, is God's presence, that God's presence on earth. And so great examples of this would be like Japan. Remember, the Japanese believe that the emperor was descended from the goddess Amaterasu. Other European nations like Great Britain had a long tradition of divine right among its kings. So did France. So those are great examples of the divine right theory. The fourth theory is the social contract theory, and this one is a more modern theory. But basically, the social contract theory says that people freely give up their power to government in return for protection and well-being, that the government's going to be watching out for them. And so this idea comes from the fact that the government, or the ideal, is that the government will serve the will of the people. A great example of countries like this would be the United States. When we were formed with the Constitutional Convention in our modern government today, it says that it's going to protect the people. In exchange, the people are going to give the power of government to the government. So those are the four theories about how states form. Well, next we're going to get into the purposes of government. Why do we even bother having a government? Why do we need one? And what we're going to be looking at is the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. It's located on page 7 in your textbook, so you can look for it there. It's 52 words long, and it goes, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect nation, a more perfect union, establish justice." I don't have it in front of me. "In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So, yes, I can do it. I haven't thought about it since last fall, actually, so not too bad. But the preamble to our Constitution, there you go. I struggled through it, but I got through it. You're eventually going to have to know that. We will be taking a short quiz on that at some point. So just watch for the schedule. I believe I have a link on Wiki that is a little song done by Schoolhouse Rocks that will help you to memorize it as well if you need some extra backing. So let's talk about those 6 things that our government is supposed to do for us that's laid out in the preamble. The first says that it helps us to form a more perfect union. Well, that just means that it helps our states to get along better, that we're not going to be constantly fighting each other, to try and get them to work together in order to build up our strength. The second was that it helps us to establish justice, a legal system. That's really all that boils down to, because in our first government, the Articles of Confederation, we didn't have that. So it helps to establish that legal system. The third is that it helps to ensure domestic tranquility. Well, domestic tranquility, what the heck does that mean? Well, domestic tranquility means, domestic means home, tranquility means peace. So it helps to ensure our peace at home. It helps to keep the peace at home, meaning that we shouldn't have any civil war, we shouldn't have any domestic disturbance, that kind of stuff. Not so much like at home in your house, domestic disturbance, but within our country, domestic disturbance. The fourth is that it provides for the common defense. That just means our military, having our Army, Navy, Air Force. What's kind of interesting is that in the Constitution, defense is mentioned more times than anything else. So it obviously was a huge concern for our founding fathers. It's something that they thought they really needed to address, so they really hit home on that. The fifth is that it helps to promote the general welfare, which just means keeping everybody happy and healthy. So because of that, our government is involved in our public schools, environmental protection, the welfare system. The list goes on, but that's really what it boils down to. And then the sixth is that it helps to secure the blessings of liberty. All that means is that it's helping to guarantee our freedoms for citizens, that we have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, all those things are included in there. So when you look at the preamble, how does the preamble represent the social contract theory? Because we talked about that we were a prime example of the social contract theory. Well, how does that actually happen? Well, it's in the first 3 words. We the people. We the people give the government these jobs to do in order to protect us. So that is a great example of how that happens. Now, there are several different forms of government, and we haven't really gotten into that yet, but we're going to. So we're going to look at the different kinds of government. The first is a unitary, and a unitary form of government just means that all the powers are held by the government through a single agency. It's a central agency that has all the power. A great example of this would be Great Britain and Parliament. Parliament has all of the power in Great Britain. The second form of that would be, or another form of that would be federal. In a federal form of government, the powers of government are divided between a central government and some local governments. And it could be just the federal government or the national government and the state governments, or like us in the United States, we have a national government, state government, then local government. So there's multiple levels. The next one is a confederate. And a confederacy is an alliance of individual states that these nations are working together for some purpose. Typically, it has very limited powers. They're only able to do certain things. For example, Civil War, United States. That's a great example of a confederacy. There's only one confederacy in existence in the world today, and it is the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is made up of former Soviet satellite nations. Next, we're going to look at how the legislative and executive bodies have a relationship. The first is a presidential, and a presidential is a separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. That they're not codependent. They are independent of each other, but they're equal in power. So they both have some say in what happens. Typically in this you have an executive that's called the president. Not always is it called the president, but usually it is. Great example is the United States. We have a presidential form of government where the executive and legislative branches of government work separately, but they both have equal power as to what they can do. The next form of government is a parliamentary form of government. And in a parliamentary, the executive branch is chosen by and responsible to the legislative branch. So the executive branch in the parliament would be the prime minister, is chosen by the parliament and has to answer to the parliament. So it's not equal, it's not independent. They work very closely together. In fact, the parliament can at any time, not just an election, but at any time decide that the prime minister is not doing his job and get rid of him. So that is something that's very, very different than the presidential form. A great example would be Great Britain. The next group of governments that we're going to look at is the number who can participate. How many people can participate in this government? The first kind is a dictatorship. And a dictatorship is those who rule don't have to do what the people say. They're not responsible to the will of the people. A dictatorship is the oldest form of government and the most common in the world. Basically, a dictator has absolute power that cannot be challenged. Nobody can challenge him. And if they do, then there's dire consequences. Great examples of dictatorships: Cuba is a dictatorship. North Korea is a dictatorship. So those would be examples of that form of government in the world today. The last form of government is a democracy. And in a democracy, the supreme authority is with the people who are governed. They have the final say. So basically that just means they are voting on everything. There are two types of democracy. The first is a direct democracy where every person votes on every public policy. So you would be voting just about every day on things that are going through Congress. The second type, which is much more effective, is representative. And in a representative form of government, small groups of people act as representatives for the larger population, and they go in and do the work of government. And again, a great example is the United States. So throughout this, you should see that the U.S. is several different forms of government. You know, we formed through a social contract theory. We have a federal system of government. We have a presidential system of government, and we have a representative democracy. And all of these things work together. We also talked about Great Britain having several of these different things as well, that they have a parliamentary form of government and that they have a unitary form of government, but they're also a democracy. They're a representative democracy. So as we get on in government, we're going to be talking about how these things are going to impact what governments do and how they interact with each other.